이런 과학 이런 것들이 많이 나와서 좀 미래 이 작가님이 정말 약간 사명을 가지고 하고 있구나 이런 마음이 떠올라서 조금 울컥하는 감정이 있었습니다.
When the experiment using various words is over, an artificial intelligence model is used to find out one's perception of each word and its correlation with oneself.
이게 지금 크기가 원의 크기가 반복한 개수거든요. 가장 큰 게 기쁨, 이제 고통 이런 단어도 한두 번 말씀하셨었고 이별.
제가 이 단어들을 반복한지 몰랐어요.
그죠.
네. 무의식 속에서 나온 것 같아요.
그래서 마음, 설렘, 기쁨 요 세 가지 단어가 작가님의 단어예요. 정확하게 이 개개인의 어떤 생각의 흐름들 어떻게 보면 자기 자신도 모르거든요. 자기 자신도 모르는 이 내 마음의 어떤 흐름과 내 마음의 상태를 좀 알게 하면 얼마나 좋을까 이런 생각이 좀 있고요. 그것을 이제 뇌를 통해서 우리가 좀 이루어낼 수 있지 않을까 그런 좀 기대감이 있습니다.
Being able to see the brain means being able to objectively understand the status of me and my counterpart. Where knowledge is, there will be your heart also. Dr. Wu hopes that neuroscience will help people better understand one another and embrace the differences.
제가 경험한 과학 연구는 내 자신의 내가 가지고 있는 질문과 직면하고 또 그 질문들을 내 주변의 이웃들을 위해서 만들고 해결해 나가는 과정이라고 생각이 들고 그래서 내 자신의 얼굴과 또 내 이웃의 얼굴들이 늘 아른거립니다. 사실 과학 연구를 할 때. 그래서 이렇게 적어봤습니다.
On the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Arirang TV, I wish to extend my warmest congratulations to the leadership, journalists, and producers and all members of the Arirang family. Over the past 3 decades, Arirang has played an important role in introducing Korea's culture, society, perspectives to the audiences all over the world. I sincerely hope that Arirang TV will continue to grow, to reach wider global audiences, and make even greater contributions to the dialogue and mutual understandings among the nations over the world. I wish Arirang TV continued success and bright futures in the years ahead.
아리랑 아리랑 아라리요 아리랑 고개로 넘어간다 힘껏 달려라 멈추지 마라 세상 끝까지 가자 아리랑 아리랑 가라리요
Iran says it won't engage in direct talks with the United States, but is reviewing a U.S. proposal to end the war, while President Donald Trump insists Tehran is eager for a deal despite publicly denying it. President Lee Jae-myung called on South Koreans to conserve energy, especially electricity, while the government plans to more than double its temporary fuel tax cuts to help reduce the financial strain on households and businesses. South Korea's growth forecast has been cut to 1.7% by the OECD, as escalating conflict in the Middle East undermines earlier signs of a global economic recovery. We begin with the war in the Middle East. Iran says direct talks with the U.S. are off the table, but it's reviewing a U.S. proposal aimed at ending the conflict. Lee Seung-jae starts us off.
Iran says it has no intention of holding direct talks with the United States, but is reviewing an American proposal to end the war. According to Iranian state media on Wednesday, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stressed that exchanges of messages through mediators do not mean negotiations with Washington.
No negotiations have happened until now, but over the past few days, our American counterparts have begun sending messages through other countries that are our friends. If there are messages through others, to which we respond with our own position and demands, that is not called conversation, nor negotiation, or anything.
Earlier in the day, media reports from Iran said Tehran would reject a U.S. ceasefire offer, and that the country had instead presented its own conditions for ending the conflict. A senior political security official cited by state broadcaster Press TV said Iran's five-point counterproposal includes a demand for sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical oil shipping route. Other conditions reportedly include a complete halt to what Iran calls aggression and assassinations, guarantees the war will not resume, clearly defined war reparations, and an end to fighting across all fronts involving regional resistance groups. However, the demand over the Strait of Hormuz could be a major sticking point. U.S. President Donald Trump earlier suggested the waterway could be jointly controlled by the U.S. and Iran's leadership, a proposal likely to face resistance. Meanwhile, the Associated Press reported that Iran has received a 15-point peace plan from Trump. The U.S. president said negotiations are underway, but Tehran has denied that any direct talks are taking place. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Now, despite Iran rejecting direct talks with the U.S., U.S. President Donald Trump has dismissed the claim as false, insisting Tehran is eager to negotiate an end to the conflict. Moon Hae-ryun has the details.
U.S. President Donald Trump says Iran is eager to strike a deal to end the conflict, claiming its leaders want negotiations very badly but are afraid to say so publicly for fear of being killed by their own people or by the United States. Speaking at a Republican fundraiser in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, Trump added that talks are already underway. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt also told reporters that negotiations are ongoing and productive, even though Tehran has yet to accept a U.S.-backed ceasefire framework. She declined to reveal specifics of the proposal or the talks, stressing their sensitivity, but acknowledged that some publicly reported details are inaccurate.
What I will tell you is these talks are ongoing. We're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details that have been exchanged between the United States and Iran at this time.
Despite Iran's public denials that negotiations are taking place, the White House insists that back-channel discussions are continuing. At the same time, Leavitt underscored that Trump is prepared to escalate if Iran refuses to compromise, warning that Tehran must recognize what she described as its weakened position after weeks of conflict.
President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell. Iran should not miscalculate again.
According to the U.S. Central Command, the campaign has already hit more than 10,000 targets, dealing significant blows to Iran's military capabilities and sharply reducing its ability to carry out missile and naval attacks. Looking ahead, the administration is signaling that the conflict could be relatively short-lived. Leavitt reiterated a projected timeline of roughly 4 to 6 weeks, suggesting an end before Trump's rescheduled summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping in mid-May. The White House says that trip, delayed due to the conflict, is now back on the calendar, even as efforts to secure a ceasefire continue. 문혜련, Arirang News.
The White House also says global tariffs will rise to 15%, despite a U.S. Supreme Court ruling against President Donald Trump's earlier tariff plan. Now this, despite ongoing economic pressure from the Middle East situation. Oh Soo-young has more.
The White House has reaffirmed that the US is still moving to raise its global tariff rate to 15%, even as the war with Iran shakes energy markets and adds new pressure to the global economy. Speaking at a Politico event, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro said the higher rate is already in process. That comes despite the Supreme Court ruling that struck down President Donald Trump's earlier reciprocal tariff regime. The court said Trump could not use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose broad reciprocal tariffs on trading partners. In response, the administration moved to replace them with a temporary 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act. That provision allows tariffs of up to 15% for 150 days without congressional approval. Navarro said the ruling was the best possible outcome, arguing it blocked only one tariff route while leaving other trade tools intact. While the administration has yet to issue the order needed to formally activate the 15% rate, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said earlier this month that the increase was expected soon. Trade Representative Jameson Greer also said some countries would face tariffs of 15% or more. This adds further concern for global markets and trading partners, especially with the Middle East situation already pushing up oil prices and inflation risks. For South Korea, which already faced a 15% tariff on US-bound goods, the immediate impact is more limited than for countries that initially agreed on lower tariff rates. But uncertainty remains over negotiations with Washington, as the $350 billion investment package tied to the tariff deal needs to be clarified. Also, America's Section 301 investigations, which respond to what it considers unfair trade practices, could potentially lead to additional tariffs or restrictions. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
In the meantime, Iran says it may allow stranded South Korean ships to pass through the blockaded Strait of Hormuz, but on the condition of direct coordination with Tehran. Speaking here in Seoul today, Iranian Ambassador Said Kuichi said Tehran views South Korea as a non-hostile nation and is willing to allow its ships to transit the Strait of Hormuz. The ambassador stated that safe passage would require the submission of specific vessel data and direct prior coordination with the Iranian military. He also warned that this relies on South Korea keeping its distance from U.S.-led military operations, expressing deep appreciation that Seoul has not yet joined Washington's Maritime coalition. A Seoul official told reporters on Thursday that the ambassador's remarks were not conveyed through government channels. 26 South Korean commercial vessels and nearly 180 crew members currently remain trapped in the vital waterway. As the conflict in the Middle East nears the one-month mark, concerns are growing in South Korea over possible energy shortages. And President Lee Jae-myung today called for energy saving during an emergency economic meeting. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yujin has more.
With the government's emergency response framework now in place, President Lee Jae-myung says the focus must now shift to execution as South Korea braces for possible energy supply disruptions stemming from the Middle East conflict.
과거와는 비교할 수 없을 정도로 복잡하게 얽힌 글로벌 공급망 속에서 위험의 위치와 파급 경로를 정확하게 짚어내는 것이 거의 불가능한 상황입니다. 이에 정부는 비상경제 대응 체계로 전면 전환하고
President Lee chaired an emergency economic meeting with relevant ministries at the Blue House on Thursday, the second such meeting since the conflict began last month. The meeting came a day after the government announced the launch of an emergency economic task force led by Prime Minister Kim Min-seok. In his opening remarks, Lee delivered a direct message to the public, urging them to help conserve energy, particularly electricity.
정부가 100% 책임을 지고 있는 구조라서 전기요금은 웬만하면 지금 변경하지 않고 유지하려고 합니다. 그런데 전기요금을 계속 이대로 유지할 경우에 손실폭이, 즉 적자폭이 엄청나게 늘어날 수가 있고
The Korea Electric Power Corporation is the state-run utility responsible for supplying nearly all of the country's electricity. Its debt has surpassed 200 trillion Korean won, which is more than $132 billion US dollars. That message carried into the afternoon when President Lee doubled down on the need to cut back on energy use during a visit to the Korean National Oil Corporation's oil storage base in Seosan, Chungcheongnam-do Province.
지금은 뭐 다 아시겠지만 어쨌든 최대한 원유를 확보하고 또 소비를 좀 줄여서 이 위기를 잘 극복하는 것이고요.
The facility is South Korea's largest oil storage base with a total capacity of 14.6 million barrels. Inspecting the site, President Lee urged officials to ensure the tanks are handled safely. 송유진, Arirang News.
Now, as global oil prices continue to surge, the government is rolling out aggressive measures to buffer the shock. From imposing new price caps for petroleum products to expanding fuel tax cuts and restricting naphtha exports, policymakers are racing to protect both industries and households. Joining us in the studio is our correspondent, Park Junan. Welcome back, Junan.
Thanks for having me, Tami.
So, Junan, walk us through the policies that were announced earlier today first.
So, Tami, the first thing is the adjustment of fuel prices caps on domestically refined oil. 2 weeks after implementing a domestic oil price cap, the government has set new 2-week price caps for gasoline, diesel, and household kerosene, saying they will be raised slightly on Friday in response to sharply rising international oil prices. The gasoline price ceiling will rise from the current 1,724 won to 1,934 won per liter, which is around $1.29 US, while diesel will increase from 1,713 won to 1,923 won. Household kerosene will also go up from 1,321 to 1,531 per liter. Compared to the price caps set 2 weeks ago, these adjustments represent a uniform increase of 210 won across the board. In percentage terms, the ceiling for gasoline went up by about 12.2%, diesel by 12.3%, and household kerosene by nearly 15.9%. Despite these increases, the government noted that expanded tax cuts, also set to take effect on Friday and last until May 31st, will have observed even steeper spikes, effectively lowering gasoline prices by 65 won per liter and diesel prices by 87 won. And these announcements came after President Lee Jae-myung held a second emergency economic meeting on the Middle East crisis. Let's take a listen to what Finance Minister Gu Yun-chul had to say.
In particular, we will place a strong emphasis on stabilizing diesel prices, which are essential for industry and logistics. We will newly include marine diesel under the price cap system and expand fuel tax cuts, increasing the reduction for gasoline from 7% to 15%, and for diesel from the current 10% to 25%, a larger cut than for gasoline.
Also on Friday, the government will enforce export restrictions on naphtha, a key feedstock widely used in the petrochemical and other industries, particularly in the production of plastics. Let's take a listen.
First, to secure sufficient naphtha supplies, we will maximize imports by providing support to cover price differences for overseas purchases and ensure that naphtha is supplied as a top priority to sectors such as healthcare, key industries, and the production of essential goods.
While there have been brief instances of panic buying and temporary shortages of trash bags recently, the government clarified that there is no cause for lasting concern. Also, the government said it will closely monitor items vulnerable to price fluctuations and provide necessary support.
I see. Now, Junan, I'd like to ask, why is it so critical for the government to take such aggressive measures to subsidize energy costs? And who are the beneficiaries? And also, who are the ones that are about to take the greatest burden when oil prices go up?
Right, Tommy. So first, those who benefit the most are major oil companies and their shareholders. Well, historically, when oil prices spike, global and local energy giants post massive profits. In previous shocks, the wealthiest investors, especially the top 1%, captured a large share of these windfall gains through stocks, funds, and direct ownership. But for most people, an oil price hike is not a good sign. Higher energy costs drive up inflation, slow economic growth, and worsen trade balances. Central banks may have to keep interest rates higher for longer, raising the risk of an economic slowdown amid inflation, a scenario often referred to as stagflation. For Korea, a resource-poor nation with one of the highest oil dependencies among developed countries, every jump in oil prices increases national import costs. At the industry level, the impact varies. Refiners may temporarily benefit by passing higher crude costs on to consumers, but petrochemical, steel, chemical, and transportation companies face sharp rises in production costs. For ordinary citizens, the burden is heavy. Lower and middle-income households spend a bigger portion of their budget on fuel, heating, and transportation. As gasoline and utility bills rise, families cut back on other spending, slowing consumer demand. That is why the government is moving aggressively to contain the impact of rising oil prices. Even a distant conflict can quickly ripple through the economy, driving up costs, fueling inflation, and weighing on growth here in Korea.
Indeed. Junan, thanks for the wrap-up tonight.
Thank you, Amy.
Now, while the government is doing all it can to reduce the impact on daily life, a supplementary budget plan is set to be submitted to the National Assembly next week, urged by the president for swift processing. Ian Jin reports.
The government and the ruling Democratic Party are pushing for a supplementary budget proposal set to be submitted to the National Assembly on March 31st for swift processing. The announcement was made Thursday morning during a consultative meeting between government officials and DP lawmakers. This is part of efforts to mitigate the economic impact of the prolonged war in the Middle East. The plan is aimed at easing the burden of rising fuel costs, stabilizing livelihoods, and supporting small and mid-sized firms.
The 2026 supplementary budget proposal was developed to respond to high oil prices resulting from the war in the Middle East, as well as to support the livelihoods of vulnerable groups, such as small business owners and young people, to minimize damage to domestic industries and secure supply chain stability.
With the extra budget, the government plans to not only compensate oil refineries for losses incurred due to the government's implementation of a price cap system for petroleum products, but also to support the expansions of oil reserves to ensure the stable supply of naphtha and other rare earth elements. To reduce dependence on fossil fuels in the medium to long term, the party and government will also use the budget to support the distribution of residential renewable energy, such as solar power. Projects to promote public transport use for energy conservation will also be expanded. The extra budget will also expand assistance to support vulnerable groups, which includes low-income earners, small business owners, and young people, along with efforts to eliminate blind spots in welfare services to ensure that daily livelihoods are not affected by the Middle East conflict. Support funds will be discussed further and finalized at a later date. The government highlighted that this supplementary budget uses the excess tax revenue expected this year for the benefit of the people, and that it would not issue additional debt. as President Lee Jae-myung urged for swift parliamentary approval to minimize further economic damage. 이은진, Arirang News.
The ongoing conflict in the Middle East is now exerting a notable drag on South Korea's economy, leading the OECD to lower its growth forecast for the country to 1.7% this year. Kim Do-yeon reports.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has issued a stark warning. The global economy's resilience is being severely tested by the crisis in the Middle East. According to the OECD's March interim economic outlook on Thursday, South Korea's economic growth for 2026 is now projected at 1.7%. That is a 0.4 percentage point drop from the organization's previous forecast in December. Inflation in South Korea is also expected to worsen, with the forecast adjusted to 2.7%, up 0.9 percentage points. The primary driver behind this gloomy outlook is South Korea's structural vulnerability to global energy shocks. As a manufacturing powerhouse that imports nearly all of its crude oil, with a massive share coming directly from the Middle East, prolonged warfare poses a direct threat to domestic production. The OECD highlighted that among G20 nations, South Korea's heavy reliance on Middle Eastern energy makes it uniquely exposed to energy shortages and supply chain disruptions. This domestic downturn runs parallel to a broader global stagnation, as it's reflected in the global economic outlook. While the OECD maintained its global growth forecast for 2026 at 2.9%, it initially expected an upward revision to 3.2% until Operation Epic Fury in late February. The organization explicitly stated that this expected 0.3 percentage point gain was entirely erased by the geopolitical conflict. Other major economies are also facing downward pressures due to the conflict and shifting domestic factors. The OECD projects U.S. growth to slow to 2.0% in 2026, driven by weakened purchasing power. The Eurozone is forecast to take a direct hit from surging energy prices, with its growth dropping sharply to 0.8%. Japan is also expected to see a slowdown to 0.9% as a rising cost of energy imports offsets the demand generated by its new expansionary fiscal policies. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
BTS's Swim, the lead single off its fifth album, Arirang, recorded roughly twice as many streams as the band's hit Dynamite on its first day on Spotify, reaching over 14.6 million. This figure is 1.3 times and 1.9 times more than BTS's previous hits Butter and Dynamite. Now, following their comeback show at Gwanghwamun Square, BTS saw first-time listeners on Spotify surge by over 690%, while streams of their new album jumped to 120% after their performance. The group also appeared on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon on Wednesday, delivering the first ever TV performance of Swim at the Guggenheim Museum, and are set to return for a second consecutive appearance on Thursday. In other news, Nora Noh, a pioneer of Korea's fashion industry, is holding a special exhibition in downtown Seoul to celebrate her 99th birthday. Our culture correspondent Park Gun-woo sat down with her for an exclusive interview to capture her extraordinary journey.
7 decades after Korea's first ever fashion show, Nora Noh, aka Korea's Coco Chanel, looks back on her near-century-long lifetime. After a divorce at around 20, Noh boldly left her family behind to study fashion in the U.S.
I chose a new path where I had to risk everything. As I stepped on the plane, I couldn't be anxious or feel sad at all.
Overseas experiences opened her eyes while also visiting developed countries, including Italy. Noh was struck by the sharp contrast with Seoul, especially in the aftermath of the Korean War.
During my visit to Italy, I heard about how the country successfully recovered through the textile industry. That's how I returned, thinking how to apply it with Korea.
At a time when only few Koreans could afford her designs made with Korean silk, Noh turned outward, proposing exports to the U.S. instead. Noh said at first U.S. people didn't know a thing about Korea, but our persistence paid off, with later Korean-made garments showcased in major U.S. department stores.
At my first fashion show in New York, many journalists came expecting European designs, but it was mine, Korean brand, Korean design, made with Korean fabrics. My designs were praised and described as under well-controlled elegance, clothes that aren't flashy but are subtly stylish, so I felt proud.
Now Noh says K-fashion stands at another turning point amid K-culture's global dominance.
Korea has the potential, as I've already shown that myself. Koreans are leading in every industry, so why not fashion? We need to revive the textile industry, while also exploring new Korean fabrics.
Noh also stressed the need to pass fashion down through generations. Her successors now taking that vision global.
We showcase our collections twice a year in the U.S. with strong interest from local buyers. We're working with 50 retailers now and plan to expand further.
선생님께서는 다음 목표 같은 게 또 있으실까요?
I want to thank everyone who helped me, because nothing's possible alone. I hope to be remembered for craftsmanship and pride in my work. Everyone needs to have pride in their job, which is how Korea developed.
To give back, Noh has displayed around 70 of her pieces for a free exhibition in Seoul, marking her 99th birthday. Running through mid-July, the exhibition highlights her legacy and craftsmanship, showing how the K-fashion industry has evolved and where it's headed next. 박건우, Arirang News.
We'll see mostly clear skies nationwide tomorrow, but clouds will pass through the capital area and Jeollanam-do province from early morning to late morning. Jeju-do Island will stay mostly cloudy. Meanwhile, air quality will be at bad levels nationwide. Dust will build up due to stagnant air, and dust from overseas will move in during the day. From late tonight into tomorrow morning, fog will develop across many areas. It'll be especially dense in the west and parts of the central and southern regions, with visibility dropping below 200 meters. Tomorrow, Seoul will start the day at 8 degrees Celsius, Daejeon at 6 degrees, Busan at 9 degrees. Then by the afternoon, Seoul will get up to 20 degrees, Chuncheon at 22 degrees, Jeju at 21 degrees. Clear skies will continue for now, and we'll see large day-to-night temperature swings, so make sure to dress in layers. Now here's a look at the weather around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching and good night.
Are you curious about Korean cultural heritage?
If you are a fan of Korean culture and history, listen up. Korean cultural heritage is based on a 5,000-year history.
The whole country is like a massive museum because it possesses such diverse cultural properties. Let's not wait any longer and take a look.
First, for beginners. For those who are not familiar with Korea, let's start with the world-famous list.
You can see how Korea's beautiful traditional patterns and historical features have been preserved.
And don't forget to experience Korea's intangible cultural heritage. From Gangang-sulrae to Talchum, there's just so many exciting cultural heritages to experience.
These are for intermediate level tourists who have already visited Korea and its famous attractions. You might even be standing in a World Heritage Site right now.
How about searching for intangible cultural heritage that you can experience? 한소리, 제주 해녀 diving, 김장. Make some unforgettable memories while having fun.
Last but not least, the advanced level. It's the memory of the World Register. Korea possesses an extensive documentary heritage. Korea is serious about documentation and preservation.
A tour of Korean cultural heritage will become a legacy of your own.
Why not make your own Korean cultural heritage travel itinerary?
Isn't it fascinating?
Knock knock! The magical door to the world of K-animation is swinging wide open. Meet your instant new BFF, the adorable Catch. Tina Ping will have you hooked from the very first glance. Need a hand? Our Robocar Pony Rescue team is always zooming in to save the day. How about tagging along on Pinkfong and Pal's super exciting quest to reclaim their lost magic? With the mysterious life forms Cabion by your side, you can become a Cabion master and save humanity like a total hero. Protecting children's innocence while igniting their boundless imaginations. That's the magic of Korean animation. K-animation, the ultimate bestie for kids worldwide.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. South Korea's democracy appears to be rebounding on the global stage. According to the Democracy Report 2026 released by the Freedom Institute at Sweden's University of Gothenburg, Korea's democratic standing rose sharply from 41st to 22nd among 179 countries. The report also says the country has regained its status as a liberal democracy, the highest category in the Freedom's classification. The improvement follows a turbulent period in Korean politics, including the failed attempt to impose martial law in 2024 and the institutional response that followed. For a closer look on what the latest report tells us about Korea and the global state of democracy, we are joined by Nora Noh, researcher at the Freedom Institute, the very team behind the Global Democracy Report. A very big welcome.
Thank you. Greetings from Sweden.
And also joining us is Lee Hyun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Good to see you, Professor.
It's great to be back on the program.
So let's start a discussion right away. So Dr. Nord, before we delve in deeper, could you briefly explain for us how the Freedom Institute measures democracy and what the key global findings are this year?
Right. So we stand for varieties of democracy. That means that we measure democracy in different ways. But at the core aspect of any democracy is what we call electoral democracy. And this is the extent to which elections are free and fair, and you have an equal level playing field around elections. So it's freedom of speech, freedom of association. And then in Democracy Report, we also stay with the Liberal Democracy Index. This is the one that goes beyond elections and also checks how democracy functions between elections. That's first of all, it's constraints on the executive power from the legislative branch and from the judicial branch, and it's also the protection of civil rights and equality before the law. So if we look at the results of this year's report, the main finding is, of course, that the third wave of autocratization, the one that has been going on for the last 25 years, it continues. So now 74% of the world population live in some type of autocratic regime. To compare, only 7% of the world population live in liberal democracy. We have now more autocracies than democracies in the world, 92 autocracies, 87 democracies. In 44 countries, the situation is getting worse in terms of level of democracy. And then, of course, one of the main findings is that this trend of autocratization has now reached the United States.
That's a very helpful context on how the report evaluates democracy worldwide. So South Korea has moved up sharply from the 41st to the 22nd in the latest rankings. Professor Lee, what does this rebound tell us about the current state of Korean democracy?
Well, I think you could say that Korea's democracy is vibrant and resilient. In terms of thinking about what was described by Dr. Nord, here, Korea's really a response to the martial law crisis, I think really shows that there are real restraints and checks and balances in place that are essential in a democracy. So here we're talking about constraints specifically on the executive branch. And of course, the presidency is the head of the executive branch. And so when you see what happened during the martial law period, you saw the constitutional mechanisms sort of working in lockstep with the legislature. And then eventually, of course, with the Constitutional Court, eventually confirming the impeachment of President Yoon. But more than that, you also see, I think, within Korea's democracy, the rule of law and this kind of accountability, where it comes to political officials, officers of the government, there are places and checks in place where high-level officials have been brought to the courts to face justice. And other cases where you see now legislative and institutional reforms that are put in place, as well as you saw even during the martial law crisis and generally in Korea's history, a lot of civic participation, whether it be in response to a crisis where people are on the streets in protest, but also with the high rates of people in Korea participating in elections. But despite all that, there's also some areas for concern as well, because the current ruling party has a supermajority in the legislature, as well as the presidency. And they've, of course, introduced a number of wide-ranging reforms when it comes to the prosecution, the judiciary, as well as other elections and other reforms. And one concern that I think it needs to be mentioned here is, despite those clear advances, there are concerns that, given the fact that the ruling party has this real power within the legislative and the executive branch, is what kinds of reforms are they pursuing? Is it really in the interest of democracy and constitutional sort of checks, but also is it truly kind of in their own interest? And I think that's an area where I think lots of people are concerned that because power is now centered really in one party, that the opposition is not as effective in voicing concerns about these kinds of issues going forward.
Right. So there's, it's really an important thing to have, and important to have a department that could check and balance the situation as well. But going back to the report, when we take a closer look at the data, Dr. Nord, what were the main indicators that actually led to South Korea's 19th place jump in this year's report?
Yeah, it's something that Professor Lee has already described. It's constraints on the executive coming from the legislative branch and from the judiciary branch. And of course, it's also the quality of elections. And within the electoral democracy index, the one that drives this improvement the most is freedom of expression and everything that's around that. And one of the things that doesn't go into the democracy index, but what we see also in our data is that pro-democracy mobilization is rising in South Korea, which means that citizens are willing to reject authoritarian rule again and again and again. So I think this is something that's very important, and it shows that South Korean democracy is both fragile but also very resilient.
Then from a constitutional perspective, Professor Lee, what does that episode about the martial law attempt actually reveal about the resilience of South Korea's democratic system?
So as everyone knows here, South Korea's constitution was revised in 1987, and that was towards the end of sort of this authoritarian rule in Korea where you had military dictators ruling the country. And so in 1987, you had this constitutional revision, which set in place the current kind of this mechanism that actually dealt with President Yoon's short-lived martial law declaration. So there you had the National Assembly coming together, voting those members who were present to unanimously rescind the martial law, which is the part of the constitutional mechanism and apparatus. And then, of course, you had eventually, we talked about in terms of the process by which the president was impeached, and the Constitutional Court then stepping in to play its role with respect to potentially checking, unauthorized use of executive power. And I think in this case, what you can say is the Constitution has been really resilient in the face of really a big pressure and a big test with the martial law declaration just a couple of years ago. And so I think in this case, you can say that the Constitution really served its purpose here and really put a effective check and balance on this presidency, so that we didn't have to go through martial law periods like we did in the past, where martial law was declared and basically you had an imperial presidency that basically took over the entire country, where the rule of law was not really put into place, but used in a way that potentially abused citizens' rights, and it led to, of course, many deaths in that process as people were protesting the imposition of martial law. And so I think at this point, when we're seeing what the Constitution looks like today in Korea, I think what we can say is the Constitution worked. And it worked in a way that I think people around the world recognize that Korea's democracy really is something which will not necessarily go back to authoritarian rule, because people have established this democracy over the many years now. And I think the response from the people is very clear. And no one could imagine even today that martial law would be something that could be tolerated, especially in a situation which was clearly unjustified. So I think the bottom line is the Constitution worked. And I think this is where I think Koreans can see that this mechanism was very effective in dealing with the crisis.
Right. So it really underscores how critical these institutional checks and balances are in these kinds of moments of crisis. Now, a while ago, Dr. Noh, you've mentioned about South Korea having returned to the category of liberal democracies. Could you clarify for our viewers again, what does that classification actually mean? Is it the highest level?
It's the highest level, and it means that democracy goes far beyond the quality of elections. It means that you have true separation of powers, and that the legislative and the judicial branches really constrain the executive in attempts to exercise power. And there is the second aspect to it, is that civil rights are protected, and then rule of law is functioning well enough. And just for someone to understand that this is not just mere explanation of being a liberal democracy, means this is more or less the highest level that you can achieve. There is also a degree on this index. You can go high, of course, but it means that it's not only the elections that decide how the executive is selected, is that there is also true separation of power. And I will just remind once again that nowadays liberal democracy, it's only 7% of the world population. The number of liberal democracies has been declining during the last several decades. It's now the least common regime type in the world. There are now more closed autocracies than liberal democracies in the world. So it's really something that is becoming more and more rare. And one of the findings that we also have that the United States has lost the status of liberal democracy this year.
Wow, you've mentioned it's 7% and the U.S. has lost its status. So it clearly shows that South Korea is showing a strong level of democratic safeguards now. But when we look ahead politically, in the month of June, we have local elections scheduled. Professor Lee, how important do you think the elections would be in testing the strength of Korea's democratic institutions?
Well, obviously critically important because when you're looking at elections, right, that is the linchpin when we talk about democracies, that people have a voice and they can select people that will then rule the country. And so in this case, the elections have to be free, they have to be transparent, and they have to be efficient. And I think in this case, when we look at the elections that are coming up, we're talking about local elections, regional elections, and I think there's a real test here because in this case, while we've had an election for the presidency because of the impeachment, now this is sort of the first kind of nationwide election sort of after this martial law period. And I think there are going to be people, there have been critics who've been very concerned about whether these elections will be, in fact, fair, because there's certainly a subgroup of people who believe at some level in terms of conspiracy theorists who would say, well, those elections were not necessarily free, they were somehow influenced by outsiders. But in any event, the point being is that it has to be apparently and transparent with respect to how these officials are elected. But also, when it comes to elections, the question is also accountability without, weaponization. And what we mean by that is once people get into power, whether it's the ruling power or it's the opposition, I think there's a real concern that once someone gets into power, the concern is they won't be ruling the country with the nation's interest in mind, but they do it in a way that is very political, meaning in the sense that you will attack your political opponents and use the legal process as well as the judicial process as a weapon. And I think this is the real concern because we've seen in the past where, depending on which administration you're talking about, people have gone to jail. And I think it's a little bit ironic because whether or not you agree, and depending on what side of the political aisle you stand on, you had President Lee, you had President Park, and President Yoon, for whatever reasons to be, of course, put in jail by more, let's say, liberal presidents. And I think the underlying concern is despite all these reforms and talking about democracy, that one threat to this issue becomes, payback and retribution. And I think this becomes really a big test because in lots of countries around the world, there's an underlying, I think, undercurrent where people are very suspicious about whether or not the ruling party or whoever goes in power is not necessarily looking at the country's interests as a whole in mind, but really using the process to go after their enemies. And I think that's why a lot of people can be skeptical of democratic processes because of the way it's used in relationship to the power that it yields. So I think these elections will be very important, I think, in terms of what we'll see as the outcome, because once people get into power, then you have some time to judge and assess whether or not their time in power was used for the national interest.
Now, alongside these kinds of discussions about the local elections, there are also growing talks in Korea about constitutional reform, including tightening martial law provisions and expanding decentralization. Professor Lee, how do these debates reflect lessons from recent political events?
I think these are clearly the reforms and also the laws that now have been even put into place are direct effects of what happened in terms of the martial law declaration. Because in the past, in terms of when martial law was declared, right, there was a time period when the National Assembly could then rescind martial law. But now this will require sort of pre-approval of the National Assembly with respect to how martial law is going to be conducted. And, that is a direct sort of response to the situation where the National Assembly was interfered with even by police, and not police, but the military, sort of maybe preventing lawmakers from actually meeting, so that now you have a law in place that doesn't allow military officials in that context to prevent lawmakers from convening. So a lot of these loopholes that you mentioned, I think here are trying to be resolved with this current administration to say that this shall never happen again, where a president declares martial law and then the legislature is essentially potentially locked out from actually conducting its constitutional authorized duty to offer a check against that sort of effort by the president. But also, the issue of concentration of power is really, I think, the biggest lesson here, because there's always been this question in Korea about how powerful the president should be. And so historically, because the president has been very, very powerful, there have been efforts made over the years to decentralize his or her authority. And so I think this will be the kind of mechanics that you'll see going forward in terms of further proposals that are being made to curbing the power of the president when it comes to certain kinds of issues, particularly as it relates to martial law.
Right. So really, in many ways, the reform debate seems closely tied to the lessons from that political crisis and the level of public trust on the leadership as well. Now, when we step back to the global picture, Dr. Nord, you've mentioned a while ago about a striking point about the United States, which dropped from 24th to the 51st, and that it also lost its liberal democracy status. What does this divergence say about broader global trends in democracy?
Well, with the United States, we see that the constraints on the executive do not function well enough. So it's an executive overreach undermining the rule of law, and also far-reaching suppression and intimidation of media and dissenting voices. So we call what's happening in the United States is a rapid and aggressive concentration of power in the presidency. And if you think about it, it's quite a typical pattern for democratic backsliding for the last 25 years. So we know that this is something that has happened also in other countries, most prominently in Hungary under Orban, and Turkey under Erdogan, then also in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, in Russia under Vladimir Putin. So many examples. So Trump is not the first one to follow that pattern. So it's something that is called executive aggrandizement. So gradually the power is concentrated in one person or a small group of people, and then the constraints on the executive power are dismantled step by step. What's different in the United States case is that it happens very rapidly and it happens very aggressively. So just to compare, for example, in Hungary, it took more than 4 years to reach the same level of decline on a liberal democracy index. And in India and in Turkey, it took more than a decade to reach the same level of decline. So there it was very gradual, very slow process. In the United States, it happens so rapidly and so aggressively that I think everyone was shocked by the speed of deterioration.
So the comparison clearly puts Korea's rebound into a broader global perspective, I believe. Now, even so, the report warns that democratic backsliding is still occurring worldwide. Dr. Nord, where does South Korea now stand within that broader picture?
Well, South Korea is one of the examples that we study of so-called U-turn cases or cases of democratic resilience. So there are two things that we know: that cases where you still have some constraints on the executive, where the judiciary and the legislative function is a constraint, they are more resilient to executive aggrandizement, similar to what you had with an attempt to impose martial law, or similar to what's now happening in the United States. And then the second thing, it should be societal resistance against autocratization. And that's something that we also saw in South Korea, where millions of people were on the street demanding the protection of democracy, fighting for democratic rights and freedoms. So there should be always two combinations. One of the factors that we also see from the data is that once there is an attempt for executive overreach, still democracy remains very fragile, and another attempt may follow in the nearest future. And then South Korea is again a very typical example where you had to go with impeachment twice during the last decade, which is quite rare. But so it's on the one hand, it's an example of democratic resilience. On the other hand, it's also an example of being a fragile democracy. And one of the problems that I see with South Korean democracy is that you have an extreme political polarization in South Korea, and that's something that unless this is addressed, South Korean democracy will remain fragile.
Right. So now the real challenge would be how we will keep on building this momentum and strengthen our democratic institutions moving forward. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Dr. Nord.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Lee, we really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on the program.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.
아리랑 TV 창립 30주년을 정말 진심으로 축하드립니다. 우리의 문화를 정말 세계에 널리 울려 퍼지게 만들어주시는 정말 엄청난 일들을 하고 계시는데요.
아리랑 TV의 30주년 너무나도 축하드립니다. 벌써 창립 30주년이시네요. 대한민국을 알리는 아리랑 TV 너무나도 사랑하고요. 응원합니다.
창립 30주년을 축하합니다. 전 세계 대한민국을 알리는 아리랑 TV 응원합니다.
30주년이라는 긴 세월을 이렇게 걸어왔다면 그 축하받을 만한 일이고 앞으로 더욱더 발전할 수 있으면 좋겠습니다.
월 씌우고 철 씌우고 지화가 좋다. 아리랑 TV 창립 30주년 축하합니다. 월 씌우고